The 5 most complicated, most unintuitive jobs with the most difficult openers and rotations. One for each role, for when you really want to get challenged when you play. Don't say I didn't warn you. Now, just to be clear, this does not imply that the other jobs in the game aren't necessarily hard to play, and depending on context, some may even be harder to play. Also, remember that whether these jobs are actually really hard to play is also just my opinion, of course, and each player finds different things difficult. So, I would love to hear what jobs you find the most difficult to play in the comments. Also, please excuse me if some of the combat demonstrations aren't completely perfect. After all, these jobs are the most difficult to me, so it would almost be more weird if I didn't make any mistakes, right? Now, the jobs in question are Dark Knight, Astrologian, Black Mage, Machinist, and Monk. All these jobs have the property in common that they have extremely high skill ceilings compared to the other jobs in their respective roles, sometimes combined with high skill floors as well. They may also have either overwhelmingly complex and high pace openers or unintuitive openers. This can also include having several significantly different openers that are all worth learning. Finally, these jobs may also be very punishing to make mistakes on. I should mention that as we are looking at these jobs through a lens of difficulty, we are going to be focusing on perfectly optimized rotation as much as possible. Meaning that even if any of these jobs may have alternate rotations that are relatively intuitive and easy to use, if the optimal rotation is complicated, it still qualifies. The subjects we will be looking at to showcase the difficulty of each of these jobs will be their openers, their 2-minute burst windows, as well as how their rotation works out between bursts. We may of course also be looking at specific unique properties of each job that makes it difficult outside of these 3 specific aspects. Now then, let's start with the easiest among the 5, the Dark Knight. The opener includes 16 OGCDs, 2 of which are used before the fight starts, meaning you need to keep a close eye on the pull timer. These remaining 14 OGCDs are spread over 8 GCDs, leaving exactly 1 GCD free to weave the use of a tincture, and requiring 7 double weaves to cover everything within raid buffs. It should be stated that assuming that raid buffs come out perfectly on time, you do have 1 bonus GCD to use any OGCDs you may have missed before raid buffs end. This still puts an incredible amount of strain on you for your entire opener and can make it problematic for a Dark Knight to deal with needing to use any defensive cooldowns during the burst. An additional detail to the opener is that you are also depending on your The Blackest Night TBN to be consumed during the burst, so you want to make sure you put it on the correct target. Once the burst ends though, the Dark Knight rotation is relatively tame. 1-2-3 combos and stockpiling MP, only using enough to keep Dark Side running, TBN for big hits, and if you cap out. Aside from that, between bursts you will have to sometimes use Salted Earth and usually at least 2 plunges. The game plan is to have as much MP and blood gauge as possible when the next burst rolls around, which actually also leads to a high skill trick to optimize every 2-minute burst. Obviously, fitting as many Edge of Shadow casts in your burst windows as possible is going to maximize your damage. With a full MP bar and blood weapon during the burst, you know for certain you can fit 4 edge casts. But if you manage to plan it such that you enter the burst with the Dark Arts buff from TBN, you could make this 5. This adds a requirement to both know the fight very well, but also to be able to optimally plan your uses of TBN so that Dark Arts will be available in time for the burst. But also at a time where you won't need to use Edge to spend excess MP, and you will not need to use TBN for any other reason either until the burst begins. In fact, during the burst, if the fight calls for TBN at that specific moment, a real Master Dark Knight may be capable of using another TBN during the burst, and make use of the kickback Dark Arts through the burst with no loss. Speaking of the burst, your GCD situation will likely not be much different beyond having 1 or 2 extra blood spillers in place of 1-2-3 combo steps. Your OGCD situation will change based on whether you manage to yoink that extra Dark Arts just right, and how well you stockpiled MP for the burst. Naturally, Salted Earth will only line up with your burst in the opener and 6 minutes into the fight. Outside of downtime that can realign them at other times, most of your 2-minute bursts will have slightly less intensity than the opener. However, 6 minutes in, That potential 5th edge will ultimately make that burst more extreme than your opener. Amongst all the tanks, it is very common to have a building or downtime period between bursts. So the fact that Dark Knights stockpile 2 resources and even incorporate taking damage as part of the stockpiling strategy, combined with the extremely high-paced burst periods, makes it the most complex and difficult tank to master of the 4. Next up, Astrologian. Among these 5 jobs, Astrologian has the longest pre-pull preparation, including both drawing a card at least 30 seconds before the fight begins, and placing Earthly Star up to 20 seconds before the fight begins. Once the opener itself starts, the GCD portion of the rotation as a whole is not particularly impressive, as is common for healers. But the OGCD part is where the magic happens. Well, technically the magic also happens in the GCD part, since you shoot magic, but that's besides the point. Lightspeed is used because of the sheer amount of OGCDs you need to get everything done in time while the raid buffs are still running. After that, the amount of OGCDs you need can vary from 9 with no redraws and a Lady of Crowns draw, to 12 with 2 redraws and a Lord of Crowns draw. Remember, the highest difficulty part of the opener is the fact that you tend to have around 1 second to decide who to place your card plays on, and given a random factor, you may sometimes need more time than that to get it right. Now, as a healer, it is not unlikely that you could be forced to use OGCD healing during your opener, but I would imagine that it is uncommon. However, outside of bursts, Astrologian isn't necessarily significantly more difficult to manage than any other healer. However, you will want to place Earthly Star on cooldown and play 1 card on the odd minutes in the fight, as well as play and draw a minor arcana and manage your dot, of course. As the healing part of the rotation has a difficulty that is largely dictated by the difficulty of an encounter itself, I cannot comment much on this, and arguably we could also consider the difficulty of the Dark Knight based on the difficulty of an encounter. So instead, let's look past this and focus on the attacking rotation part. The fact that you play 1 card on the odd minutes has a profound effect on your 2-minute bursts. Your opener plays 3 cards followed by Astrodyne. Your 2-minute burst plays 2 cards followed by Astrodyne and 1 more card. Your 4-minute burst plays 1 card, Astrodyne and then 2 more cards. And your 6-minute burst can start with Astrodyne, followed by 3 cards, and then chaining another Astrodyne should it be convenient. Meaning that essentially you need to deal with 4 different burst windows throughout a fight. Naturally, every burst window is going to unfold mostly the same. You place Earthly Star leading up to it, you have a card prepared before you start the burst, and you play 3 cards, Divination, a Minor Arcana, and Astrodyne, while having Lightspeed for the burst. However, the randomness and the decision making does make Astrologian's bursts very complex to manage. Compared to the other healers, the attack rotation and so the card plays makes Astrologian, no contest, the hardest healer to work with. However, in terms of healing and generally defensive cooldown planning, a shield healer like Scholar may be more difficult to manage depending on the individual encounter, so I will highlight that as an honorable mention. Next up, the first DPS, Machinist. Just to be clear, this is while considering the recent quality of life additions to the job in regards to Hypercharge and Wildfire. In fact, these quality of life additions don't really change anything about how you play Machinist optimally at all. Starting with the opener, you'd think the intuitive move would be to use your 3 tools that do a massive amount of damage on cooldown right out the gate, right? Wrong. Optimally, you want to use 2 of them, then do a 1-2-3 combo, and then use the 3rd tool. There are multiple reasons for this. The first reason is that using Air Anchor and Drill immediately will still allow you to sneak in an extra drill just before raid cooldowns end. And delaying Chainsaw due to its very long cooldown is less likely to result in you missing out on an extra cast of it over the course of the fight, while still letting you fit it in the raid cooldowns by delaying it initially. Additionally, delaying these cooldowns this way, if the rotation is performed perfectly throughout the fight, leaves a perfect hypercharge window between Drill and Chainsaw, which then also leaves space for an additional hypercharge window after Chainsaw, completely removing ineffective 1-2-3 combo steps from your burst. That's right, you're delaying the initial Chainsaw because in every 2-minute burst, it is going to matter. Machinist also has a light pre-pulled prep with reassemble and an early tincture. But the bigger heartstopper is the 14 OGCD weaves combined with the hypercharge window, adding a total of 12 GCDs too. In terms of the rotation between bursts, Machinist isn't that intense, but does very strictly require that the 3 tools get used precisely on cooldown, lest it will mess up your bursts every 2 minutes for the remainder of the fight. Finding time to spend excess heat gauge without messing these cooldowns up can also be a pain point, and also offers opportunities to optimize, should there be any damage buffs to receive from other players to align with this. The fact that you also get a little bit of freedom in your odd-minute automaton queens means that you have to learn when is best to use these between burst windows, without losing battery gauge for the burst windows themselves, turning this freedom into another aspect to perfect and master. Aside from all this, the rotation for Machinists outside of bursts is relatively straightforward. Assuming you manage to use your cooldowns on time and keep your resources stockpiled just right, the burst every 2 minutes is almost exactly the same as the opener, with the only big difference being the 1-2-3 combo being replaced by an extra hypercharge. This of course means that if you delay something like drill as much as a single GCD, then all of this will fall apart. Either you delay the entire burst 1 GCD, or you have to skip the first drill in the burst to try and realign it later. But this does mean that the difficulty of the Machinist rotation is in the way that one single mistake can cost you up to 2 minutes down the line, both in actual DPS loss but also in making your burst rotation even harder or flat out impossible. The way Machinist's rotation differs from Bard and Dancer in difficulty is that they either have less to manage and prep leading up to a burst. Dancer's resources, all the things they need to manage strictly, has a lot more wiggle room to readjust later. Bard's songs, making Machinist's strict bursts that rely on your rotation between bursts having 0 mistakes, the hardest of the 3. The second DPS, the Black Mage, is probably not a very surprising choice, as I imagine most players agree on this one. Black Mage's opener, simply put, is all about casting as many fire spells as possible and making use of as many damage boosting cooldowns as possible, as quickly as possible, regardless of how minuscule the damage gain is. Swift cast and triple cast standing out as particularly small damage gains. The unintuitive part of the Black Mage opener is that, for most jobs, you would use the first few GCDs on preparing to burst, which would, for Black Mage, suggest that the opener should be Blizzard 3, Blizzard 4 and Thunder 3, and then use Fire 3 to start your burst. The reality is that Black Mage's average fire magic potency is so high that the Black Mage gains more damage over the course of a fight by minimizing the amount of ice magic spells that are cast at all, regardless of what it means for where your fire magic spells land. This also means that while Black Mage has the capability to stockpile 2 triple casts, 2 polyglots, sharp cast, ley lines and all of this to use in the 2-minute burst windows, aside from ley lines, which automatically lands in the burst, all of these tools are better used on making sure you can continue to cast your spells in general, uninterrupted, than saving for bursts, based entirely on the fact that Black Mage's average potency is so high. Of course, if the 2-minute burst just so happens to land just right with where you are in your rotation, you can get creative to maximize the value you get out of it, but ultimately, Black Mage, uniquely among these 5 jobs, doesn't actually care that much about the 2-minute burst. On the other hand, however, Black Mages care a lot about maximizing their damage in general, which leads us to something far more complicated: transpose lines. This can, for example, be translating a Firestarter proc into around 1% more damage by incorporating transpose than you would if you didn't. Well, 1% damage gain for a set of around 10 spells, the so-called line. Wait, don't fall asleep, I will try to not get too technical with this. There are also tricks you can do by tracking when exactly your MP ticks are happening, you know, those that normal jobs just get, like every 3 seconds, and surely it'll come around regularly enough that you don't need to care much about it. Yeah, when mastering Black Mage, you need to track that extremely closely. These transpose lines can allow you to force decent fire phases to line up with raid buffs, like for example finishing a fire phase, transposing into ice and using ley lines, and spending just enough time there to be able to afford 5 fire force and a despair. But of course, this is only possible if you have enough spell speed. Now, I promised I wouldn't get too technical, and this isn't a Black Mage dedicated video either, so let's round it up before I drown in all these transpose lines. But before we move on, I simply want to remind you that the legendary infinite paradox rotation takes root in transpose lines. It just so happens to use lines that aren't exactly recommended. Now, as I said before, I think most will agree that Black Mage is the most difficult of the mages to master, but I do want to give an honorable mention to Red Mage, as the freedom to plan melee combos, as well as optimizing the uses of Acceleration, Swiftcast, Flash and Contra Sixt, still gives it a pretty high skill ceiling. Which leads us to the hardest of all the jobs to play. Again, remember this is just my opinion. Monk of the Melee DPS has 5 distinctly different openers, with one being the default one and the 4 others being available for different kinds of special cases, ranging across specific kill times, timings with reopeners, and fights where you need to finish your opener faster. The openers are commonly referred to based on what masterful blitzes they include. Lunar Solar, Double Solar, Solar Lunar, Early Solar Lunar and Early Double Solar. But even with that, just the basic Lunar Solar can be difficult to do consistently and may take time to master due to the high pace of the monk job just in general, combined with the precision of the opener. While many openers have a very strict optimal order, for most of them making a single mistake in the order is a relatively small difference, if any at all. Monk being almost entirely GCD based for their damage means that pressing the wrong button at the wrong time can lose an enormous amount of damage. Additionally, just like how many openers the Monk has, it also, of course, has 2 different rotations. A looping rotation and one that, rather than try to enforce a specific loop, just considers optimizing the use of your cooldowns based on where you happen to be in your combos when the cooldowns roll around. Which one works better for each player depends on whether you learn more easily by following a fixed sequence or by knowing the general idea of the job and then knowing a few key things to watch out for. Although, at a glance, I would assume that the rotation that doesn't make any concessions to force a loop will be capable of doing ever so slightly more damage over the course of a fight. The real scary part about the Monk that makes it so complex is that the job both relies on GCDs for nearly all of its damage, but also needs to be in the right place in its rotation when cooldowns roll around, which can lead to multiple different scenarios that you have to deal with for your burst. You could realistically be anywhere in the 18-step sequence that comprises the Monk's Downtime rotation, and you either need to make sure you are in the right place when cooldowns come up, or you need to know how to lead wherever you happen to be into a good burst. Now, the 2-minute bursts in general aren't too different from the opener. You are still using 2 perfect balance, you are still using your damage cooldowns, and so on. The only difference is that 2 out of 3 of your 2-minute bursts, Riddle of Wind, will not be there. And of course, where you are in the rotation when the burst comes around can have a huge impact on how you perform it in the first place. In my opinion, the difficulty of the 2-minute burst is far more heavily reflected in the lead up to the burst itself than actually doing the burst. Speaking of Riddle of Wind, for the supermasters of the job, there are ways to optimize Riddle of Wind to make sure it gives you the largest amount of extra auto attacks, which does impact your damage output enough to consider, but not exactly enough to put into numbers. Now, the reason I believe Monk is harder than the other melee DPS jobs is because of how the GCD plays into the bursts. Reaper doesn't care about where it is in the GCD when its burst rolls around. Ninja cares extremely little about it, and in most burst windows don't really care at all. Dragoon cares only a little bit due to life surge, but only Samurai would care about where exactly it is in its GCD when the 2-minute burst comes up. However, unlike Monk, Samurai has an extremely simple way to standardize their loop with the help of Hagakure, even allowing the Samurai to easily account for downtime wherever necessary. I talk about these melee DPS comparisons in a bit more detail in my aptly named melee comparison video, which, if you are interested in these kinds of discussions, you may find helpful or fascinating too. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can like the video, leave a comment, subscribe and hit the bell to get notified when next I post a video. If you want to give even more support than that, then you can also become a member of the channel. Fun fact, while you optimally want 2 plunges in every 2-minute burst as a Dark Knight, and the cooldown perfectly lines up to do this, the fact that you may occasionally need to cast Unmend for a filler in a fight can cause Plunge to drift out of the burst window, leaving you with only 1 to use. This is because Unmend reduces the cooldown of Plunge by 5 seconds, which is a very easy to miss mechanic due to its niche usefulness.